This is why I hate flying commercial. I hate the smell of the plane. Ugh.
Garrett Whitfield did not fly commercial. He had not sat in a commercial aircraft seat in over 7 years. He owned a Gulfstream G700 that smelled like Italian leather and ambition. He had a pilot on retainer. He had a CO pilot who knew exactly how he liked his cabin temperature, 68 degrees, no exceptions. But today, the universe had jokes. A mechanical failure had grounded his jet at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, and the next available private charter was 6 hours out. 6 hours he did not have. There was a meeting in Chicago, a $2.3 billion acquisition that had taken his legal team 9 months to structure, and if he was not sitting at that table by 4 in the afternoon, the entire deal would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. So here he was, seat 2A, first class, on a Delta flight to O'Hare. Angry did not begin to describe it. Garrett was the kind of man who controlled everything. His schedule, his empire, his emotions. He had built Whitfield Capital from a single real estate deal at 23 into a sprawling portfolio worth north of $11 billion. He had graced the covers of Forbes and Bloomberg Businessweek. He had shaken hands with senators and dined with heads of state, but he could not control a turbine engine malfunction on a Tuesday morning. He sat rigidly in his seat, his jaw set like granite, scrolling through emails on his phone with the kind of focused intensity that made the flight attendant hesitate before offering him a beverage. His charcoal Tom Ford suit was immaculate. His Patek Philippe gleamed under the overhead reading light. Everything about him screamed wealth, power, and a man who was not to be disturbed. The boarding door was still open. Passengers were still shuffling in, dragging roller bags and clutching boarding passes with that particular brand of low-grade anxiety that commercial travel inflicts on people. Garrett ignored all of it. Every face, every voice, every rustling jacket and crying child, until he heard her voice. It was not loud. It was not directed at him. It was soft, almost musical, spoken to someone very small. "Come on, sweet girl. Almost there. Mama's got you." And then a second voice, a tiny one, babbling something that was not quite a word but carried the full conviction of a complete sentence. Garrett's thumb stopped mid-scroll. He knew that voice, not the baby's, the woman's. He knew it the way you know the melody of a song that once played on repeat during the most important season of your life. He knew it in his bones, in the spaces between his ribs, in that hollow chamber behind his sternum that he had spent 2 years pretending was not empty. He looked up, and the entire aircraft shrank to the size of a pinhole, walking down the aisle toward him, toward first class, toward the seat that fate or cruelty or some cosmic sense of humor had assigned directly next to his, was Naomi Jackson, his ex-wife. She looked different, not worse. God, not worse. If anything, she looked like she had been distilled into a more concentrated version of herself. Her dark brown skin had that particular glow that comes from something deeper than skincare routines. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, natural and elegant. She wore a simple olive green wrap dress and white sneakers, and she moved with the kind of unhurried grace that motherhood sometimes gifts to women who surrender to it fully because she was carrying a baby on her hip. And there was another one, strapped to her chest in a carrier, sleeping with the kind of reckless peace that only very young humans are capable of. Twins. Garrett felt the floor of the plane tilt beneath him. Naomi had not seen him yet. She was focused on maneuvering down the narrow aisle, one hand steadying the baby on her hip, the other gripping a diaper bag that looked like it weighed more than the child. She was murmuring something soothing, her lips close to the awake baby's ear, and then she looked up. Their eyes met, and for 3 full seconds, neither of them breathed. There is a phenomenon in psychology that researchers call the frozen moment, that instant when the brain encounters something so emotionally overwhelming that it temporarily suspends all executive function. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making and rational thought, essentially goes offline. The amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, takes over completely. You cannot think. You cannot plan. You can only feel. That is exactly what happened to both of them. Naomi's lips parted. No sound came out. Garrett's hand tightened around his phone so hard the screen protector cracked along one corner. The baby on Naomi's hip, a little girl with enormous brown eyes and 2 tiny puffs of curly hair, looked at Garrett with the open, unbothered curiosity of someone who had no idea she was sitting in the middle of a detonation. "Naomi," Garrett said. One word, her name, but it came out like a man surfacing from deep water, gasping, involuntary, raw. Naomi blinked. Once, twice. She straightened her posture, and Garrett watched the walls go up in real time. It was something he had seen before, that shift from vulnerability to composure that she could execute faster than anyone he had ever known. She had learned it young, growing up in a household where showing too much feeling was treated as a liability. "Garrett," she said. Her voice was level, controlled, perfectly neutral, but her eyes were not neutral. Her eyes were a 5-alarm fire. She glanced at the seat number above 2 billions, then at the boarding pass tucked into the outer pocket of her diaper bag, then back at him. "You have got to be kidding me," she whispered. To understand what was happening on that plane, you have to understand what had come before it. And what came before it was a love story that had once been so luminous that people who witnessed it up close said it made them believe in things they had stopped believing in. Garrett Whitfield met Naomi Jackson at a charity gala in Manhattan. He was 31. She was 28. He was already wealthy, not yet a billionaire, but well on his way, with a reputation for being brilliant, relentless, and emotionally inaccessible. She was a clinical psychologist who had just opened her own practice in Brooklyn, specializing in trauma recovery for women of color. She had been invited to the gala as a guest speaker, not a donor. They were not supposed to meet. The seating chart had placed them on opposite sides of the ballroom, but Naomi had stepped outside during the cocktail hour to take a phone call from a client in crisis, and Garrett had stepped outside to escape a conversation with an investor who would not stop talking about cryptocurrency. They collided, literally, at the terrace door. His scotch splashed across the front of her navy blue gown. "Oh, for the love of—" Naomi had looked down at the stain spreading across the silk, then up at the man responsible. Garrett, who was not accustomed to being flustered, was flustered. "I am so sorry. That was entirely— I will pay for that." "You will pay for a Carolina Herrera gown because you were not watching where you were going?" Yes, absolutely." Naomi had studied him for a moment. Then she laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one. Head tilted back, full-throated, with a snort at the end that she immediately tried to suppress. "You look like a man who is not used to apologizing," she said. "I am not," he admitted. "Then this is good practice for you." That was the beginning. What followed was the kind of courtship that unfolded slowly, and then all at once. Garrett, who had dated models and socialites and the daughters of other billionaires, found himself completely undone by a woman who did not care about his net worth, who challenged every assumption he made about power and vulnerability, and who, on their 4th date, told him plainly that she would not be impressed by expensive restaurants if he could not also sit with her in silence and be comfortable. He could. That was the thing. With Naomi, he could do things he had never been able to do with anyone else. He could be still. He could be uncertain. He could admit that the empire he was building sometimes felt like a very elaborate way of running from a childhood where nothing had ever felt secure. Naomi saw him, not the Forbes version, not the boardroom version, the real one, the boy from a fractured home in rural Pennsylvania who had taught himself to read financial statements at 14 because controlling money felt like controlling the chaos that had defined his early life. And Garrett saw her too, not just the composed, brilliant psychologist who held space for other people's pain with such steadiness that you would never guess she carried her own. He saw the girl who had grown up in Southeast D.C., who had lost her father to gun violence at 9, who had put herself through Howard University on a patchwork of scholarships and sheer refusal to be defeated. They married 14 months after the Scotch incident. Small ceremony. 30 guests. A rooftop in Brooklyn overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Naomi wore white. Garrett cried. His best man later said it was the first time he had ever seen Garrett Whitfield's face do something other than calculate. For 3 years, it was extraordinary. And then, Victoria Ashford happened. If you are watching this, and you have ever felt the sharp sting of losing someone you love, not to death but to misunderstanding. Then stay with this story, because what happened next will test everything you think you know about trust, pride, and the cost of silence. Like and subscribe now, because this story is about to break wide open. Victoria Ashford was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and rearrange its chemistry without saying a single word. Blonde, patrician, old money from Connecticut with a smile that could cut glass. She had gone to Wharton with Garrett, and she had never, not for one moment in the 15 years since, stopped wanting him. When Garrett married Naomi, Victoria sent a crystal vase from Tiffany's with a card that read, "Wishing you both every happiness." Naomi had put flowers in it. She did not know that the woman who sent it had already begun planning the architecture of the marriage's destruction. Victoria's strategy was not crude. She did not try to seduce Garrett. That would have been too obvious. And Garrett, whatever his flaws, was not a man who would cheat. Victoria understood something more dangerous. You do not have to break a marriage from the outside if you can convince the people inside it to break it themselves. She started with proximity. She maneuvered herself onto the board of a non-profit that Garrett funded heavily. This gave her access to his calendar, to his events, to the social ecosystem that surrounded him. She became useful. She connected him with investors. She attended the same conferences. She was always there, always pleasant, always just slightly too attentive. But the real work happened with Naomi. Here is something that psychologists call relational aggression, a form of social manipulation that operates through relationships rather than direct confrontation. It is disproportionately used in adult social dynamics, and it is devastatingly effective because the target often does not realize they are being manipulated until the damage is already done. Victoria befriended Naomi. She showed up at Naomi's practice with a donation for the clinic's pro bono fund. She invited Naomi to lunch. She complimented her work, her style, her marriage. She positioned herself as an ally, the kind of well-connected friend who could help Naomi navigate the rarefied social world that came with being married to a billionaire. And then, slowly, surgically, she began to plant seeds. I saw Garrett at the Meridian dinner last Thursday. He did not mention you were not there. Oh, I am sure it is nothing, but someone at the foundation gala said they saw Garrett and some woman from his London office having drinks at the Mark, probably just business. You know men like Garrett. They compartmentalize. My ex was the same way. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. None of it was true. Garrett had never been unfaithful. The woman from the London office was a 62-year-old managing director named Margaret, who had 3 grandchildren and a passion for competitive bridge. The Meridian dinner had been a last-minute obligation that Garrett had texted Naomi about, but Victoria had access to enough surface-level facts to make her fictions feel plausible. And Naomi, brilliant, perceptive Naomi, who could diagnose manipulation patterns in her clients with clinical precision, had a blind spot. Her blind spot was her own history. Growing up, she had watched her mother be lied to, over and over, by men who wore devotion like a costume. She had built her entire adult life around the determination to never be that woman, never be the one who did not see it coming. So when Victoria's whispers landed in that wound, that ancient pre-verbal wound of a little girl who learned early that love could be a lie, Naomi did not analyze them the way she would have analyzed a client's situation. She felt them, and feeling them made them real. The fights started gradually. Then they escalated. Where were you tonight? I told you. The Meridian dinner. Victoria said you did not mention I was not there. Victoria? Since when do you and Victoria Ashford? She is my friend, Garrett. She is not your friend. She is a social climber who... Oh, so now you get to decide who my friends are, the same way you get to decide everything else? This is the anatomy of manipulation. It does not create conflict from nothing. It finds the fault lines that already exist in a relationship and applies pressure. Garrett's fault line was control. Naomi's fault line was trust. Victoria did not invent these vulnerabilities. She simply made sure they collided. The marriage did not explode. It eroded, like a coastline losing ground to a tide that never fully recedes. The arguments became more frequent. The silences between them grew longer and heavier. Garrett withdrew into work. his default defense mechanism, the thing he had always done when emotional terrain became too difficult to navigate. Naomi interpreted his withdrawal as confirmation. He is hiding something. He is pulling away. He does not love me the way I thought he did. And then came the photograph. Victoria arranged it with the precision of a military operation. She hired a woman, tall, beautiful, vaguely European, to approach Garrett at a hotel bar during a business trip to San Francisco. The woman struck up a conversation. Garrett, who was 3 scotches deep and lonely, in the way that only a man whose marriage is crumbling can be lonely, talked to her for 20 minutes. Nothing happened. Nothing physical. Nothing romantic. He talked about the acquisition he was working on, and then excused himself to go to bed. But Victoria's photographer was there. And the photos, Garrett leaning close to hear the woman over the bar noise, the woman's hand briefly touching his arm, the two of them laughing at something, looked exactly like what they were designed to look like. Victoria sent them to Naomi with a text that read, "I debated whether to show you this, but I would want to know." Naomi filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Garrett was blindsided. He came home from a trip to London to find her belongings half-packed and a manila envelope on the kitchen counter containing the petition. "Naomi, what is this? Talk to me." "I have been talking to you for months, Garrett. You have not been listening." "What photographs? What are you?" "I have never, Naomi, I have never touched another woman. I cannot do this. I cannot be my mother." That sentence, "I cannot be my mother," was the one that told Garrett this was not a negotiation. This was a decision that had been made in a place he could not reach, in a wound he had not inflicted, but could not heal. The divorce was finalized in 4 months. Naomi's attorney was efficient. Garrett, in a state of shock and grief that he masked as cold pragmatism, did not contest anything. He gave her whatever she asked for, which characteristically was almost nothing. She wanted no alimony, no claim to his businesses. She took a modest settlement, enough to re-establish her practice, and she disappeared. She left New York entirely. She did not tell him where she was going. And Garrett Whitfield, the man who controlled everything, stood in the penthouse that no longer smelled like her shea butter and lavender, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely powerless. What Garrett did not know, what he would not know for 2 years, was that Naomi left New York carrying more than grief. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She did not know it yet herself. The stress of the divorce, the emotional upheaval, the sheer physicality of dismantling a life. These things had masked the early symptoms. By the time she realized, she was in Atlanta, staying with her cousin Denise, sitting on the edge of a bathtub staring at 2 pink lines on a plastic stick. Twins. The ultrasound at 8 weeks confirmed it. And Naomi made a decision that she would question every single day for the next 2 years. She decided not to tell Garrett. Now, before judgment lands, and it will, because this is the kind of decision that invites it, consider the psychology of what Naomi was experiencing. There is a concept in trauma psychology called protective isolation. When a person has been deeply wounded in the context of a relationship, their nervous system can enter a state where connection itself feels dangerous. The brain does not distinguish between the specific person who caused the pain and the broader category of vulnerability that allowed the pain to happen. So the person does not just withdraw from the source of hurt. They withdraw from anything that could create the conditions for hurt to recur. Naomi believed, fully, viscerally, in the marrow of her bones, that Garrett had betrayed her. She had seen the photographs. She had heard Victoria's whispers for months. She had felt the distance growing between them. And she had made the excruciating calculation that millions of women make: the risk of re-engagement was greater than the cost of silence. She told herself she was protecting the babies. If she told Garrett, he would want involvement. Involvement meant contact. Contact meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant the possibility of being hurt again. Not just her, but her children. Was she wrong? Yes. Was her wrongness understandable? Also yes. And that is the complicated truth about human decisions made in the aftermath of betrayal, real or perceived. They are rarely rational. They are survival strategies dressed in the language of reason. If you have ever made a decision in pain that you later realize changed everything, a door you closed that maybe should have stayed open, then you understand the weight of what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me, Have you ever discovered a truth that rewrote everything you thought you knew? Stay right here, because this plane ride is about to change 2 lives forever. Naomi sat down in seat 2B. She did not have a choice. The flight was full. The twins, Zoe and Zara, 15 months old, were already restless. Zoe, the one on her hip, was entering the preliminary stages of what promised to be a spectacular meltdown. Zara, the one in the chest carrier, had woken up during the aisle walk and was now blinking at the world with the suspicious expression of a baby who had been promised a nap and felt the contract had been violated. Garrett had not moved. He sat perfectly still in 2A, his phone now dark in his hand, his eyes fixed on the twins with an expression that defied simple categorization. It was not just shock. It was not just pain. It was the look of a man watching a door open to a room he did not know existed in his own house. "How old are they?" he asked. His voice was quiet, careful, like a man approaching something fragile. Naomi did not look at him. She was buckling Zoe into the seat between them. The flight attendant had brought an extra belt extender for the car seat she had gate-checked, and her hands were steady in that deliberate way that suggested they would not be steady if she let them do what they wanted. 15 months, she said. Garrett did the math. He was a man who had built a fortune on numbers, on calculations, on seeing patterns before anyone else. 15 months, plus 9 months of pregnancy, 24 months, 2 years. The divorce was finalized 2 years and 3 months ago. He looked at Zoe. Brown skin, lighter than Naomi's, closer to honey than mahogany. Curly hair that was not quite as tightly coiled as Naomi's natural texture, and eyes, green eyes, not brown, not hazel, green. Garrett Whitfield had green eyes. His mother had green eyes. His grandmother had green eyes. It was the one physical trait that ran through the Whitfield line like a signature, as distinctive and unmistakable as a watermark on currency. Naomi, she heard the shift in his voice. The question that was not yet a question, but was building like a wave offshore. "Don't," she said. "Are they?" "Garrett, do not." "Are they mine?" The question landed in the 4 inches of air between them, with the weight of a collapsing building. Zara started to cry, not the theatrical wail of a baby performing discomfort, but the thin, reedy cry of an infant who has absorbed the tension of the adults around her and is translating it into the only language she has. Naomi closed her eyes. She pressed her lips to Zara's forehead, and for a moment, just a moment, Garrett saw the composure slip. He saw the woman underneath the armor. He saw exhaustion and grief and love and fear and something that looked terrifyingly like relief. "Yes," she whispered. "They are yours." The plane took off. Garrett did not notice. He did not notice the safety demonstration. He did not notice the beverage cart. He did not notice the seatbelt sign turning off, or the captain announcing their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. He was doing what he always did when reality exceeded his capacity to process it. He was trying to organize it into something manageable. But this was not a spreadsheet. This was not a negotiation. This was 2 small human beings who shared his DNA, his eye color, his blood, and he had not known they existed. 15 months, he said again, almost to himself. You have had them for 15 months, and you did not. I did what I thought was right. Right, Naomi? They are my children. Lower your voice. He had not realized he was raising it. The flight attendant glanced over. Garrett forced himself to breathe. Why? He asked. Naomi was quiet for a long time. Zoe had fallen asleep in the car seat between them. One small hand curled around Naomi's index finger. Zara was nursing under a cover, making the soft, rhythmic sounds of a baby who had decided the world was acceptable again. Because I was afraid, Naomi said finally. Because I believed something about you that made it impossible for me to trust you with the most important thing in my life. What did you believe? That you had someone else, that our marriage was, that I was not enough. Garrett turned his whole body toward her. In first class, the seats were wide enough that this was possible without invading her space, but the movement itself felt enormous. It felt like turning toward a cliff edge. I never had anyone else, he said. Not once. Not for a second. Naomi, there was never anyone but you. The photographs. What photographs? And there it was, the fracture line, the place where the entire structure of their shared catastrophe had originated, not in truth, but in a fabrication so expertly constructed that it had become indistinguishable from reality. The conversation that followed took place in murmurs, low, intense, devastating. They kept their voices beneath the white noise of the aircraft engines, creating a pocket of privacy in the most public of settings. First class on a commercial flight is intimate in its own strange way. Close quarters, shared armrests, the artificial closeness of strangers in a metal tube hurtling through the atmosphere. Naomi told him about Victoria, about the months of whispered insinuations, about the lunches that had felt like friendship but functioned as reconnaissance, about the photographs that had landed on her phone like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Garrett listened, and as he listened, his face did something that Naomi had never seen it do. It crumbled, not all at once, gradually, like watching time-lapse footage of an ancient wall succumbing to weather. Victoria sent you photographs of me with a woman at a bar. Yes. In San Francisco, the Fairmont. Yes. That woman approached me. I did not know her. We talked for 20 minutes about absolutely nothing, and I went to bed. Alone. I did not know that. Because you did not ask me. That sentence hung between them like a blade. You are right, Naomi said. I did not ask you. I saw the pictures and I could not breathe, Garrett. I felt like I was 9 years old again, standing in the doorway of my mother's bedroom, watching her cry over another lie my father told before he... She stopped. Her throat closed around the rest of the sentence. There is a concept in psychology called emotional hijacking, a term coined by Daniel Goleman to describe moments when the limbic brain overrides the rational brain so completely that past trauma and present reality become fused. The person is not responding to what is actually happening. They are responding to what happened before the original wound, the foundational betrayal.
After everything I've done, this is how he wants to pay me back.
And the current situation is simply the trigger that reactivates it. Naomi, a psychologist who understood this mechanism better than almost anyone, had been unable to apply it to herself. This is not uncommon. Therapists are famously susceptible to their own blind spots. The cobbler's children go barefoot. The trauma specialist's deepest trauma remains unexamined, not because she lacks the tools, but because the wound predates the tools. I should have asked you, she said. I should have sat you down and shown you the photographs and demanded the truth, but I was so certain. Victoria had been telling me things for months, and I... Victoria. Garrett said the name like it tasted of something rancid. Victoria Ashford orchestrated this. I did not see it then. I see it now. I have seen it for probably a year, maybe longer. When did you realize? About 8 months after the babies were born. Denise, my cousin Denise, she said something. She said, "Have you ever actually confirmed any of what Victoria told you?" And I could not answer, because I had not. I had just believed, because believing was casier than hoping. Garrett leaned back in his seat. He stared at the ceiling of the aircraft, that blank neutral beige that is the same on every commercial plane in the world, and he felt something shift inside him that he could not name. It was not anger, though anger was there. It was not grief, though grief was there too. It was something more fundamental. It was the sensation of the story he had been telling himself for 2 years, the story in which his wife had left him for no good reason, in which he was the wronged party, in which his pain was clean and justified, collapsing, because the truth was more complicated than that. The truth always is, yes, Victoria had manipulated them. Yes, the photographs were staged. Yes, Naomi had believed a lie. But Garrett had also been absent. He had also prioritized the empire over the marriage. He had also failed to create the kind of emotional safety that would have made Naomi come to him first, instead of believing the worst. He had left gaps in the relationship, Not because he did not love her, but because he did not know how to love her and run an $11 billion company and also remain emotionally present in the daily, unglamorous work of being a husband. And Naomi had also failed. She had let her childhood wound dictate her adult decisions. She had not extended to Garrett the basic dignity of a conversation before filing for divorce. She had kept his children from him, not out of malice, but out of a fear so deep that it had become indistinguishable from conviction. They had both broken this. Victoria had handed them the tools of destruction, but they had picked them up and used them. There is a question that separates people who heal from people who stay stuck, and it is not whether someone else was wrong. It is whether you can hold two truths at the same time, that you were hurt and that you contributed to the conditions that made the hurt possible. If that resonates with you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let us find out what happens when the plane lands. Somewhere over Tennessee, Zoe woke up. She did not cry. She simply opened her eyes, those startling green eyes, and looked directly at Garrett. And then she did something that undid him more completely than any revelation, any confession, any photograph, real or fabricated. She reached for him, her small hand extended toward his face, with the unguarded directness that only babies are capable of. No calculation, no self-protection, no assessment of risk, just a hand reaching for a face that, on some level she could not possibly understand, looked like hers. Garrett looked at Naomi. "Can I?" "Yes." He reached over and lifted Zoe from the car seat. She was lighter than he expected and heavier than he was prepared for, not in weight, but in significance. She settled against his chest with the easy trust of a child who has not yet learned that the world can be unkind, and she grabbed a fistful of his Tom Ford lapel. Garrett Whitfield, the man who had closed a $900 million deal without blinking, who had fired executives and restructured entire companies with surgical detachment, pressed his lips to the top of his daughter's head and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The way men who have been taught never to cry finally cry when the wall they have built becomes too heavy to maintain. Naomi watched him, and she cried too, not for the same reason. She cried because she was watching a man hold his daughter for the first time, and knowing with the full, terrible clarity of hindsight, that she had stolen 15 months of this from both of them. "I am sorry," she said. "I know. I should have told you. Yes, I was wrong. We were both wrong." Zara, awake now, and apparently unwilling to be excluded from whatever was happening, began squirming in her carrier. Naomi unstrapped her and held her up so she could see Garrett. Zara studied him with the intense skepticism of a baby who takes after her mother, evaluating, assessing, withholding judgment until sufficient data had been gathered. Then she sneezed directly in his face. Garrett laughed. It surprised him. The sound coming from somewhere he had forgotten existed. Naomi tried not to smile and failed. "She gets that from your side," Naomi said. "The sneezing? The dramatic timing." For a moment, just a moment, they were themselves again. Not the wounded versions, not the divorced versions, the real versions, the ones who had fallen in love on a terrace in Manhattan because one of them had spilled scotch on the other's dress. But moments pass, and the real version of their situation reasserted itself quickly. "I want to be in their lives," Garrett said. "I know, not from a distance, not as a name on a check. I want to know them. I want them to know me." "Garrett, this is not negotiable, Naomi." She flinched, not at the words, but at the tone, the control, the command. The same quality that made him extraordinary in a boardroom made him difficult in exactly these moments. The moments that required not authority, but vulnerability. "Do not do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Turn into the CEO. This is not a boardroom. These are your daughters and I am their mother, and if we are going to figure this out, it will not be because you issued a directive." He closed his eyes, took a breath, opened them. "You are right. I am sorry. I default to that when I am scared. I was going to say uncomfortable." "You mean scared?" He looked at her, and for the first time in 2 years, he told her the truth without armor. "Yes, I am scared." The plane landed at O'Hare at 2:47 in the afternoon. Garrett had missed his meeting. The $2.3 billion acquisition would have to be rescheduled. His team would be furious. The seller's legal counsel would use the delay as leverage. He did not care. He carried Zoe off the plane. Naomi carried Zara. They walked through the jet bridge together, and to anyone watching, they looked like a family. The billionaire in the Tom Ford suit, holding a baby with his eyes. The woman in the olive dress, with another baby on her hip, moving together with the unconscious synchronization of two people who had once shared a life. But they were not a family, not anymore, and the distance between what they looked like and what they were. That was the space where the hardest work would have to happen. They sat in the Admiral's Club, Garrett's membership, Naomi's reluctant acceptance of the offer, and they talked, really talked. Not the murmured confessions of the plane, but the practical, difficult, unsexy conversation that precedes any meaningful CO parenting arrangement. There is extensive research on what children of divorced or separated parents actually need, and it is surprisingly consistent across studies. The single greatest predictor of a child's well-being after parental separation is not which parent they live with, not the financial resources available, not even the amount of time spent with each parent. It is the quality of the relationship between the parents. When co-parents can communicate respectfully, maintain consistency across households, and refrain from using children as messengers or weapons, the children thrive. When they cannot, when every interaction is saturated with resentment, when the child becomes a proxy for unresolved adult conflict, the damage is measurable and long-lasting. Anxiety, attachment disorders, difficulty forming trusting relationships in adulthood. The research is unambiguous. Garrett and Naomi were both intelligent enough to know this. Naomi knew it professionally. Garrett knew it personally. His own parents' divorce had been a masterclass in how not to do it, with young Garrett cast as messenger, therapist, and collateral damage simultaneously. "I do not want them to grow up the way I did," he said. "Neither do I." "Then we have to figure this out. Not perfectly, but well enough." Agreed. They established the basics. Naomi was living in Atlanta. Garrett was based in New York, but traveled constantly. He would come to Atlanta regularly. They would establish a formal custody arrangement through attorneys, but the spirit of it, the daily reality of it, would be collaborative. "I want to pay child support," Garrett said. "Garrett, I do not need your..." "This is not about what you need. It is about what they deserve. They are the children of a man who can provide for them, and they should be provided for. This is not charity, it is responsibility." Naomi studied him. She was looking for the CEO, the man who wielded generosity as a form of control, but what she saw instead was something she had not expected. She saw a father, a man who had been a father for approximately 3 hours, and was already restructuring his priorities with the same intensity he brought to everything else. "Okay," she said, "and I want to be listed on their birth certificates." Yes, we will need a paternity test for the legal, whatever it takes." "Okay." There was a pause. Zoe was asleep on Garrett's shoulder. Zara was on a blanket on the floor, engaged in an intense investigation of her own foot. "What are their full names?" Garrett asked. This question, so simple, so basic, cracked something open. Because a father should know his children's full names, and this one did not. Zoe Amara Jackson. Zara Adeline Jackson. Jackson, yes. Not Whitfield. You were not. I did not. I know, I am not blaming you. I am just sitting with it. Sitting with it. That was a Naomi phrase, something she used to say during their marriage when he wanted to fix a problem immediately, and she wanted him to simply feel it first. "I learned that from you," he said. "Learned what?" "Sitting with it. I am not very good at it, but I learned that it matters." Garrett called his attorney from the Admiral's Club. "I need everything on Victoria Ashford. Every board position, every financial relationship, every non-profit affiliation connected to Whitfield Capital. And I need it by tonight." "Garrett, what is this about?" "She destroyed my marriage. Deliberately. With fabricated evidence and calculated manipulation, and I'm going to make sure she never does it to anyone else." What Garrett did next was not revenge, though it had the aesthetic of revenge. It was closer to what engineers call failure analysis, the systematic examination of what went wrong, how and why, so that the system can be rebuilt to prevent recurrence. Within 72 hours, his team had assembled a comprehensive picture. Victoria's pattern was not new. She had done versions of this before, to a college roommate whose fiancé Victoria had wanted, to a business rival whose partnership she had coveted. She operated through social infiltration, information asymmetry, and the exploitation of existing vulnerabilities. She was, in clinical terms, a textbook case of covert narcissistic aggression. Garrett did not confront her publicly. He did not need to. He simply, systematically, quietly, and with devastating efficiency, removed her from every sphere of influence connected to his name. Board seats revoked, nonprofit affiliations dissolved, social invitations withdrawn, not with drama, with paperwork. Victoria called him 17 times in 1 week. He did not answer. She sent a text that read, "Garrett, I do not understand what is happening." He replied with one sentence, "I know what you did to my marriage. Do not contact me again." Now, here is the thing about accountability that people often misunderstand. Removing Victoria from his orbit was necessary, but it was not sufficient, because Victoria's manipulation had only worked because the conditions inside the marriage allowed it to work. Blaming Victoria entirely would have been easy and incomplete. It would have allowed both Garrett and Naomi to avoid examining their own contributions to the collapse. And both of them, to their credit, refused to take that easy path. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were not scored with sweeping music. They were unglamorous and often painful, and defined by the kind of slow, incremental progress that makes for terrible montages, but excellent human development. Garrett flew to Atlanta every other week. He rented an apartment, not in Naomi's neighborhood, but close enough. He learned how to hold 2 babies at once. He learned that Zoe liked to be bounced, and Zara preferred to be rocked. He learned that the sound of his voice reading aloud, anything, it did not matter. He once read them a section of the Wall Street Journal, and they were equally delighted, would settle them when nothing else would. He also went to therapy. This was not his idea. It was Naomi's condition. "If you want to be in their lives consistently," she had said during one of their early CO to parenting conversations, "you need to understand why you withdrew from me, not for my sake, for theirs. Because the same patterns that made you unavailable as a husband will make you unavailable as a father if you do not address them." She was right. She was almost always right about the psychological stuff, which was both one of her most valuable qualities and one of her most infuriating ones. Garrett found a therapist in New York, a man named Dr. Owusu, who had the calm, unhurried demeanor of someone who had heard everything and judged nothing. In that office, on a brown leather couch, Garrett began the uncomfortable process of examining the machinery of his own emotional life. He learned that his compulsive need for control was rooted in childhood chaos. A father who drank, a mother who coped by becoming rigidly perfectionistic, a household where the ground was never stable. He learned that he had built Whitfield Capital not just because he was brilliant and ambitious, but because an empire was something he could control when relationships, messy, unpredictable, vulnerable relationships, were not. He learned that when Naomi had pushed for emotional intimacy, his nervous system had interpreted it as a threat, as an invitation to enter uncontrolled territory, and his default response had been withdrawal. Not because he did not love her, because he did not know how to love her and also feel safe. This is what psychologists call avoidant attachment, a relational style characterized by discomfort with closeness, a tendency to prioritize autonomy over connection, and a pattern of emotional withdrawal under stress. It develops in childhood, typically in response to caregivers who were inconsistent or emotionally unavailable, and it persists into adulthood unless deliberately addressed. Garrett had it. He had always had it, and naming it did not make it go away, but it gave him something he had never had before, a map of his own interior landscape, a way of saying, "I see what I do, I understand why I do it, and I am choosing to do something different." Naomi, for her part, was doing her own work, not in therapy. She had her own therapist, a woman she had been seeing since before the marriage, but in the daily practice of examining her relationship with trust, she had to reckon with the fact that she had believed the worst about a man who had given her no genuine reason to doubt him. She had to reckon with the fact that her father's betrayals had created a template in her mind, a pattern of expectation that she had projected onto Garrett without sufficient evidence. She had to reckon with the fact that her decision to keep the twins a secret had been, at its core, an act of the same kind of control she had resented in Garrett. This is the hard truth about relational trauma. It does not just make you a victim. It also makes you capable of inflicting the same kind of harm you experienced, often, without realizing it. Naomi had been hurt, and in her hurt, she had hurt, not with malice, with fear. But the impact was the same. This is the part of the story that most people skip, the part where nothing dramatic happens, where no one delivers a monologue or makes a grand gesture, where two people just show up, day after day, and do the difficult, unsexy work of becoming better humans. But this is actually the most important part, because transformation does not happen in the crisis. It happens in the aftermath. If you are in that aftermath right now, doing the work, even when it does not feel like progress, this story sees you. Keep watching. Zoe and Zara grew. This is what children do, of course. They grow with an almost aggressive disregard for the complexities of adult life. They do not wait for their parents to resolve their emotional baggage before hitting developmental milestones. They simply barrel forward, dragging the adults along with them. By the time the twins were 2, they had distinct personalities that were already forming like weather patterns. Zoe was the storm, expressive, loud, demanding, with a laugh that could be heard from 3 rooms away, and a temper that flared and dissipated with equal speed. Zara was the calm after, observant, quiet, watchful, with a habit of studying people's faces with an intensity that made adults slightly uncomfortable. Garrett noticed that Zoe reached for him first, and Zara waited. He noticed that Zoe said "dada" at 13 months, a word Naomi had clearly taught them, which broke and rebuilt his heart in the same moment, and Zara said "more," not "dada," not "mama," but "more," because she was, apparently, a pragmatist from birth. He noticed everything. He was a man who had spent his entire career noticing patterns in data, and he brought that same obsessive attention to his daughters. But where data was clean and predictable, children were not. Children were chaos theory with sticky fingers. They required a kind of presence that could not be delegated to an assistant or scheduled in 45-minute increments. There is a body of research on father-child attachment that contradicts a lot of conventional wisdom. For decades, the assumption was that fathers were secondary attachment figures, important but not essential in the way that mothers were. But longitudinal studies conducted over the past 20 years have demonstrated that a father's consistent, emotionally attuned presence has measurable impacts on a child's cognitive development, emotional regulation, and capacity for secure attachment in later life. The key word is consistent. Not occasional, not performative. Consistent. Garrett rearranged his entire life to be consistent. He restructured Whitfield Capital's leadership, promoting his COO to handle day-to-day operations so that he could work remotely 2 weeks of every month. From Atlanta, where his daughters were, he learned to conduct board meetings with Zoe on his lap and Zara pulling at his headphone cord. He learned that some things were more important than a $2.3 billion acquisition, and that the most important things were about 3 feet tall and had very strong opinions about applesauce. A year into the CO parenting arrangement, something shifted between Garrett and Naomi. It was not romance. It was not reconciliation. It was something harder to name, and in some ways more profound. It was the slow development of genuine respect between 2 people who had once loved each other badly and were now learning to love each other well, not as partners, but as parents, as CEO architects of 2 small lives. They developed rhythms. Wednesday evenings, Garrett took the twins so Naomi could teach a night class at Emory, where she had accepted a visiting lectureship. Sunday mornings, they had breakfast together, all 4 of them, at a diner near Naomi's house in Decatur. The twins sat in high chairs and destroyed pancakes with the joyful abandon of tiny anarchists, and Garrett and Naomi drank coffee and talked. They talked about the girls. They talked about work. Occasionally, carefully, they talked about the marriage. I owe you an apology, Naomi said one Sunday. You have already apologized. Not for this. I apologize for not trusting you, for not giving you the chance to defend yourself, for taking Victoria's word over yours without ever once sitting down with you and saying, I saw these photos, explain, you were operating from a wound. That is an explanation. It is not an excuse. Garrett set down his coffee. Then I owe you one too. I was not present. Not the way you needed me to be. I let the business consume me because the business was something I could control, and our marriage required me to be out of control, and I was not brave enough to do that. That is an explanation too, and not an excuse. They looked at each other across a table littered with pancake debris and sippy cups, and they shared a moment of absolute clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when two people stop performing their grievances and start telling the truth. Do you think we could have made it? She asked. If Victoria had never happened. Garrett considered this honestly. I do not know. I think we would have hit a wall eventually.
To my beautiful daughters, I want you to know that Daddy is always here for you.
The same wall, my withdrawal, your mistrust. Victoria did not create those things. She just accelerated the timeline. That is what my therapist says. Your therapist is smart. She is. She also says I should tell you something. What? Naomi looked down at her coffee, then at Zoe, who was systematically removing all the blueberries from her pancake and arranging them in a line on the table, then back at Garrett. I still love you, she said. I probably always will, but I do not think loving someone means you should be with them. Sometimes it means you love them well from where you are. Garrett felt the sentence move through him like weather. It was the truest thing she had ever said to him, and it was also the most painful, because he still loved her too. He had never stopped. He had merely buried it under the permafrost of his composure, and it had survived there, frozen but alive, for 2 years. I love you too, he said. And I think you are right. That does not make it hurt less. No, it does not. There is a type of love that the ancient Greeks called pragma, a love that is built not on passion or infatuation, but on long-standing commitment, compromise, and the mutual decision to keep showing up. It is the least dramatic form of love, and also the most durable. It is the love of parents who are no longer partners, of former spouses who have transmuted their romantic failure into something steadier and more useful. It does not make for good cinema. There is no kiss in the rain, no desperate chase through an airport, no swelling orchestral score as two people finally embrace. Instead, there is a diner in Decatur on a Sunday morning, where a man and a woman who once shared a last name sit across from each other and agree, quietly, without fanfare, that the most loving thing they can do is not try again, but do better, separately, together. For the two small humans between them, who did not ask to be born into any of this, but who deserve, above all else, parents who have done the work. 6 months later, Garrett sat in his Atlanta apartment, the one that no longer felt temporary because nothing about his life in Atlanta felt temporary anymore, and wrote a letter, not an email, not a text, a letter, on paper, with a pen. He had not written anything by hand in years, and his handwriting showed it, stiff, uneven, the script of a man more accustomed to typing than feeling. The letter was to Zoe and Zara. He did not know when they would read it. He hoped not for many years, but he wanted it to exist, a record, in his own imperfect hand, of what he had learned. Dear Zoe and Zara, he wrote, by the time you read this, you will know the story of how your parents met, how they loved each other, how they lost each other, and how they found their way to something that is not a reunion but is, I think, better than pretending. You will have questions. You will probably be angry at me for being absent at the start, at your mother for keeping you a secret, at both of us for not being brave enough to fight for each other when it mattered. Here is what I want you to know. Your mother is the most extraordinary person I have ever met. She is stronger than she knows, wiser than she admits, and she loved you so fiercely from the moment she knew you existed that she made a decision I disagree with but understand. She chose to protect you from uncertainty, even at the cost of my presence. That was wrong, but it came from love. Most of the worst decisions of my life have also come from love, love that was afraid, love that did not know how to be brave. I spent most of my adult life building an empire because I believed that control was safety. Your mother taught me that the opposite is true, that safety is what happens when you let someone see you without your armor. I learned that lesson too late to save our marriage, but not too late to be your father. You are the best thing I have ever been part of. Better than every deal, every acquisition, every magazine cover, every handshake with every powerful person in every room I have ever entered. You are better than all of it, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know that. Love always, and without conditions, your father. He sealed the letter in an envelope. He wrote their names on the front. He put it in a fireproof safe in his closet, next to their birth certificates, updated now with his name listed as father, and the cracked phone screen protector from the day on the plane. Here is the ending that is not an ending, because real life does not have endings. It has continuations. Garrett and Naomi did not get back together. They did not ride off into any sunset. They did not prove that love conquers all, because love, on its own, does not conquer anything. Love is a raw material. What you build with it depends on skill, timing, self-awareness, and the willingness to be honest about your own limitations. What they built was this: a co-parenting partnership defined by mutual respect, hard-won honesty, and the shared commitment to giving Zoe and Zara the childhood that neither of them had. Garrett remained in Atlanta 2 weeks of every month. He learned to braid hair, badly at first, then passably, then well enough that Zoe once told him his braids were almost as good as Mama's, which he treated as the highest compliment of his career. Zara, true to her pragmatic nature, preferred her hair in 2 simple puffs and refused all elaboration. Naomi's practice in Atlanta grew. She began specializing in what she called relational recovery, working with individuals and couples navigating the aftermath of manipulation, infidelity, and trust violations. Her work was informed by her own experience in ways she disclosed carefully and selectively, and her clients trusted her not because she had all the answers, but because she had clearly walked through the fire and come out the other side still standing. They were seen together often, at the twins' daycare events, at pediatrician appointments, at the Decatur diner on Sunday mornings. People assumed they were together. They were not. They were something that did not have a name yet. 2 people who had failed at marriage and succeeded at something harder. Victoria Ashford moved to London. Garrett did not follow up on what became of her. Naomi did not either. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from releasing the need for your antagonists to be punished, and both of them, in their own time, found it. And the twins grew, as children do, relentlessly, beautifully, in that headlong rush toward personhood that no parent is ever fully prepared for. They grew up knowing they were loved, not in the abstract, performative way that children of wealthy, complicated families sometimes experience, but in the daily, mundane, showing-up way. Pancakes on Sunday, braids on Tuesday, bedtime stories every night, read in a voice that sounded like their own eyes looking back at them from their father's face. That is not a fairy tale. It is not a romance. It is not the story that most people expect when they hear the words billionaire and ex-wife and twins on a plane. But it is a love story, just not the kind that ends with a kiss. It is the kind that ends with a letter in a fireproof safe, and 2 girls who will one day read it and understand that their parents were not perfect, but they were present. They were not together, but they were united. They did not conquer love. They learned how to carry it, separately, imperfectly, and with both hands. And that, in the end, was enough. This story was about more than a man on a plane. It was about what happens when pride, fear, and the wounds we carry from childhood collide with the people we love most. If this story moved you, if it made you think about a conversation you need to have, a truth you need to tell, or a relationship you need to approach differently, then it did its job. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this are how we learn to be human. And drop a comment. What would you have done if you were Naomi? What would you have done if you were Garrett? I will see you in the next one.